evening, iCloners. Tonight I'm going to do a very quick tutorial on legacy particles. There was a question in the forums about the legacy starburst particle, how to make the starburst particle not blink, and how to adjust its size. So I thought I'd just do another very quick tutorial on the old legacy particle effects. Starburst particle can be found inside Particle Legacy. In the atmosphere, it's called Starburst 1. And when we hit play, we see it is very small, and it's blinking. It's blinking and it's jotting around inside this small size. So let's take a look at some of the basic characteristics of the particle. Over in the Modify panel, when we scroll down, we get to particle settings, and it has a diffuse, which is the image, and an opacity. And then we get the blend mode, addition, subtraction. If you hit subtraction, you'll see it's kind of a, makes it a little more painterly, I guess, or comic bookish. And then you get the face cam, vertical versus horizontal, where it's facing up, right? Or you use the face the cam, which doesn't matter where the camera is. It looks like it's kind of more of a 3D kind of thing. So often you'll use the face cam. Now, the basic life cycle of each individual particle has a life frame. Minimum and max, if you set a minimum that's different from your max, let's say I hit 100 for my max, that would mean that each individual instance of the particle will be random between the values of 10 and 100 frames. Remember, 60 frames is a second. So that one was slow, that one was a little faster, right? So here you're seeing the randomness where I've set it in within my life cycle. With rotation, you can set up the velocity of the rotation or the initial angle of the image here. If I wanted to have it moving as we go, let's say we set that to 20. There you go. Now suddenly it's rotating. Each instance of that particle is rotating as it goes. Okay. Now here's an interesting part of the particle. It's called the particle key. It's almost like its own little timeline for each individual particle. It has 4 instances. This is the beginning, and then you have 2 in the middle and an ending part. You can adjust the placement of the 2 in the middle, not of the ones on the end. Now, in this particular particle, I'm going to go back and set my rotation back to 0. I'm going to set the life cycle back to 10. So 10 frames. At the very beginning, the opacity is 100, it's white, and it's 15 pixels high and 15 pixels wide. Then in the second part of the frame, it's 10 pixels wide and 10 pixels high, so it's getting smaller, and it's less opaque. The opacity is set to 81. In the third instance, it's 62 for the opacity, while the width is still getting smaller at 6 and 6. And finally, 1 and 1. It's still white. You can adjust all of these things for your image and have a lot of different effects. So the particle key is very useful in making your particle do certain things over the course of its life cycle. Scrolling down, we get to the emitter settings. You can turn a particle on or off within your time frame, within your keyframe. So let's say at the beginning of our project we want it off, and then at point 8 in our project I want to turn it on. So I go to that part and I scroll down to my if you find it, click on there again, and I would turn it on, right? And then if you go into, I'm going to set this so that we can see the particle, emitter settings, you will see that at this point it turns on. So it's off here, starts emitting at that point where I've set it in the timeline. And again, you could go to, say, here, and I could turn it back off just by, you could right click, I believe, on off. Or you could go and turn it off inside the settings here. Okay, but I want it to play the whole way through so that we can mess around with it, play around with it. We're going to go to the beginning, we're going to turn it on. There we go. Now, quota and emit rate. How many times will it emit? And this is a weird one. It's measured in seconds, whereas everything else here is measured in frames. So what they're saying here is it's going to try to emit 100 times in a second, but quota means it will only be 1 on the screen at a time. Now remember, your life cycle is 10 frames, which means every 10 frames there'll only be 1. even though we have it set to emit 100 times in a second, the reality is that it will only emit, I believe, 6 times in a second if we figure that there's 60 frames in a second. So that right there is showing it's emitting 6 times in a second. Adjusting this probably will not have any effect because your quota is still set to 1 and your life cycle is only 10 frames. Now if I adjust this to 2, 3, 4, right? And if I adjust my life cycle, it would also make changes there. Okay, keeping it at 1. Now it's jumping around a lot, right? Why is it jumping around? Even within, it's a small area, but it's still jumping around. It's weird. How could I make it so it stays in one place? Okay, the emit volume is the reason that it's doing that. It's emitting from a volume that's 5 wide, 5 on the X, 5 on the Y, and 5 on the Z. If we expand that out a little bit, 50, 50, and 50, and then I'm going to put my quota at as high as it'll go, and I'm going to put this a lot higher so that you can see that actual shape. There you go. It's a box, and it's emitting everywhere within that volume, right? And you can see that shape, and you could do some interesting effects by using this. Maybe it's a package that's glowing in the night made up of particles. Let's set this back. We're going to do 5. We're going to do 1 at a time, and I'm going to set this back to, well, remember it was set at 5 originally. If you wanted it to all take place in one place and not jump around like it was doing, I would set it to 0, 0, 0, and then I could change the position where it is, but it will always be emitting from the same point. And this is interesting. It'll let you to put on some different effects by messing around with either the quota or the emit rate, right? You can do something pulsing. You can get different effects that way. Now, leaving it like this, I'm going to go back and we're going to look at the size of the emitter again. It was originally set at 15. Let's say I want to put it at 150. But if I only do it to that first one, it's going to be blinking a lot because by the time it hits the second point in the particle key, it's down to 10. Make the second particle key 150. And hope nobody has strobe effect issues. If I increase my emit rate, now it's just kind of, it's almost pulsing, right? So you can create some interesting effects, whether it's a star in the sky or maybe it's a star at the top of your tree, by playing with it that way. Now, very quickly, let's get down into the forces. Now, with a life cycle of 10, it's going to be hard to show you anything because each one of the particles will fade away within 1/6 of a second. So let's change the particle life cycle to at least 100. And again, check it out. That's a pretty cool effect. It's definitely a pulsing effect. Oops, that wasn't supposed to be 1,000. That's supposed to be 100. There we go. All right. It's kind of cool. But let's start to affect it with some forces of gravity, or forces, they're not actual gravity. Let's say we want it to go upwards. And again, let's say if we make it 100. That's pretty interesting, right? Because they're all the same side, maybe if we make them more random, we'll increase the max to say 500. We're going to increase the emitter rate, quota. Let's say if we make the quota 100 or 1,000. What if we said you can give me 1,000? Emitting 22 per second. That was still set at 18. There we go. All right. So now we're starting to see some interesting effects. Back it out, and you can see how it gets smaller as it goes. And you can also see how maybe a candle could be created through here. Give it just a touch of directional randomness. gives it kind of, you see how they would create fire using some of this. Let's say we wanted it to go down instead of up. We just change this positive value on the z-axis to a negative. Right, and now it's starting to fall. You can do the same thing with your x and y values. And the wind gives it's a more random effect for the forces. Okay? So I believe, oh, and emit volume, right? What if I now change this? I want this to be over the course of 100. I want it to emit. That's pretty small still. There we go. And the initial, let's say we want to change the rotation of the individual particles. You can come up here to the rotation, the angular velocity, right? And now you see them, they're all going to start at that same kind of turn. If you adjust the max, now we'll have some randomness in the size of the rotation. Let's set that to 2. Some small, some slow, some fast. Right. So going back to the original Starburst, to change the size, you adjust the size settings within the particle key. And the blinking issue can be done by either changing the emit volume to 000, where they will all come out at the same place. And we'll get rid of our forces. Some interesting effects here that we have with the added rotations. I'm going to get rid of this directional randomness. So you definitely can do some interesting things with some of the legacy particles. Some interesting effects are possible. Play with the quota, the emit rate, and also the life cycle. Right? And remember, if you wanted to see, for instance, remember 1,800 frames in this project. If we set this life cycle, the minimum, to be 1,800, you would see it play out once. Well, we have a quota and an emit rate that's different. Let's say we do, the quota is just 1. That's going to, I believe, even though it's rotating, that's just one particle effect over the course of our entire project. And that's following this particle key here. Let's get rid of the angular velocity, 0, 0. Right, here it is. And around the midway point, it starts to get smaller because we have this, the third point set to 6, and the final point set to 1. Okay? So that should cover about most of the characteristics of your legacy particles. Good luck, happy holidays, and I hope to speak with you again soon.